what if it's not that there are physical beings that are looking for patterns they're trying to find? What if we look at it from the perspective of the pattern? Because my view of this Platonic space is, or whatever space it is, that it has the things that we're used to, boring facts about triangles and prime numbers and things like that. But it also has much higher agency kind of patterns, kinds of minds, I think are actually specific patterns in that space. I think that these patterns are trying, in the way that a gas in a balloon is trying to get out into the physical space. But the only way they can do that is through what Don Hoffman would call interfaces, or what I call pointers. So we build something that could be a physical triangle, or it could be a xenobot, or it could be a human embryo. And when we build these things, exactly as you just said, you get more out than you put in, because you're not actually creating any of these behavioral and anatomical features. You are facilitating their appearance out of an ordered space.
Welcome back to the transmission, my friends. What if there were whole systems in the body, whole realms of biology and science that we are just beginning to understand? Not only that, but that have direct, massive philosophical implications about the nature of reality and about consciousness. Well, for as far as we've come, that really does seem to be the case. And if you're going to try to make sense of revelations of that gravity, you're going to need a pretty deep philosophical well to draw from, and that is where Dr. Matt Segall comes in. More on both Matt and Mike in just a second. I must say, of all the brilliant folks who have been in the mind meld on this show, there are some that stand out. There are some that occupy the more advanced end of the spectrum, and I would absolutely put this conversation in that category, but I would also put it amongst the most rewarding. Not that this episode is going to be absolutely overflowing with technicals and jargon or anything like that, but I do recommend some contextualization. I do recommend not going in completely dry. So given that my introductions to the work of both Mike and Matt are going to be a bit girthier than usual, and if you're one of those people who is just pathological about wanting to get straight to the conversation, you do you, bud. Dr. Michael Levin is a developmental and synthetic biologist at Tufts University, where he is the Vannevar Bush Distinguished Professor. His truly groundbreaking research on bioelectricity, morphogenesis, and cognition is reshaping our understanding of how living systems self-organize and regenerate. His work explores how cells and tissues communicate through bioelectric signals, guiding the formation of complex structures without relying solely on genetic instructions. His work suggests that biological development is not purely mechanistic, that it's following invisible organization principles, patterns akin to Platonic forms, timeless archetypal templates that shape the material world. So he's really challenging reductionist mechanistic views, and he's opening the door to a kind of biological Platonism. Helping us make sense of all of this is Dr. Matt Segall. He's a philosopher at the California Institute of Integral Studies. He's got a wide breadth of expertise and interests, but he often looks through the lens of the philosopher Alfred Whitehead, whose work really harmonizes with Mike's in an interesting way, because Whitehead rejected the static mechanistic view of classical science, instead proposing that reality is composed of dynamic processes where mind and matter are inextricably intertwined. So together, Mike and Matt's work really challenges the mechanistic view of reality that is still dominant today, and suggests that life and mind are really active participants at all levels of reality. And with that, my friends, all the links that you will need for both Mike and Matt are in the description. I would deeply appreciate it if you tickled the algorithm with a like, a sub, a comment, a share. Do subscribe to Third Eye Drops wherever you listen to podcasts. We've got hundreds more mind melds that are not here on YouTube with truly brilliant beings. And I, and hundreds of others, would love to see you over at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. We have a patron-only Discord. We do Zoom hangs, a book club. You can get rewards like stickers, pins, shirts, and more. Would love to chat you there, but presently let's do so with Mike Levin and Matt Segall. So I was first turned on to your work, Mike, by Don Hoffman. And, at first I was like, I'm not sure how their work necessarily overlaps. But the more I dug into your work, the more it started to make sense. But one of the things, just from a high level, I feel like there are very few thinkers, very few scientists who are really pushing the boundaries of all of our conceptual and scientific maps. And I think you and Don are both definitely doing that. But one of the ways that, in particular, that you're doing it, and it is of particular interest to me, is you are bumping up against these sort of hidden structures that seem to dictate the way that life forms, the way that biological organisms organize themselves. And you openly equate those things to like Platonic forms. And as viewers know, I am very, let's say, sympathetic to Platonism. If not, I might just call myself a full blown Platonist at this point in my life. But how did you come to that conclusion, or at least really confront the idea that that has to be considered, and that our existing maps, particularly the sort of, the popular one of mechanistic reductionism, just falls short there?
Yeah. Well, I guess the first thing to say is that when you say I talk about it openly, so now I do, but this is this is something that I couldn't have said years ago, right? And so this is something that's been on my mind as part of a kind of a career trajectory map, but whatever you want to call it, that I've had in my head for many years. And I think now we're to the point where it becomes productive to talk about it. I didn't. It wasn't. I wasn't not talking about it because it was taboo. It's still taboo. But the difference to me is I like to bring these things up when there's something we can do about it, when they have a productive, positive impact that they can have. And I think now is finally the time when we can do that. To talk about just what I mean by this, and the reductionism thing is kind of, I think, a little bit of separate topic, but I put a URL on the chat, and you could just take a look at the image that's there, just that first image on that page, if you guys want to see it, and then you can put it in the show later, but just so we know what we're talking about, just let me know when you can see that thing.
Yeah, right. I've got it up.
Okay, so this is the sort of thing that I've been interested in since I was quite young, and doing experiments on the computer with trying to pull out interesting patterns out of very minimal constructs. That what you're looking at is called a Halley plot, and it's a particular kind of fractal that you get by doing a very simple algorithm. It's basically a root finding method on the different points in the two-dimensional complex plane. And the interesting thing is that rich pattern, and it also doesn't hurt that it looks quite biological, very organic and so on. That kind of pattern comes from a very simple seed. It's a formula like z squared plus 7. Like, that's it. Less than 10 characters of a formula will give you something with that incredible richness. So now, as we like, it's well known that biology makes use of lots of interesting things, properties of prime numbers and all kinds of, we could name all kinds of other interesting aspects of mathematics that have this property. But for this pattern in particular, you might think biologists like two things as an acid test for where information comes from. First of all, if you propose that information comes from its DNA, or its its protein, or it's some other thing, you need to be able to say two things. You need to be able to say, first of all, that by modifying that thing, it becomes, in the physical world, it becomes a locus of interventions. So if it's DNA, then fine, show me that you can rewrite the DNA, and then the phenotype follows, and now we can say that that's where the information came from. So first of all, you need to identify a physical locus of interaction where you can actually modify the thing, right? And the other thing is that you need some sort of a history. So you need to be able to say why it's this pattern rather than some other pattern. And for biologists, usually that's a history of selection or some other kind of evolutionary path. So the thing about patterns, and there are kind of simple patterns like the facts of number theory and the distribution of primes and things like that. But then there are more complex patterns, and we can talk about even more complex ones. But something like this, neither of those things, the two tests that I just suggested, it can be said of this in the physical world, right? There is nothing you can modify in the physical universe that's going to change that pattern. It comes from that simple seed, that little, and I'm gonna call it a pointer into the Platonic space. That little seed, that prompt, that pointer, whatever you want to call it, gives you this incredibly rich pattern. And it doesn't have an origin in the physical world, because to my knowledge, there's nothing you can do in the physical world that would change it, nor is there a history of any kind of selection or anything else that will explain why it's this is the mapping from the seed to the pattern rather than something else. So I think that it's pretty clear that evolution and biology in general make use of these kind of free lunches, basically, the properties of numbers and of various computational truths of truth tables of functions that can be instantiated by proteins and things like that. Yeah, all of these are things that evolution exploits, but they don't actually originate in the physical world per se. So this is what I'm very interested in. And now we're to the point where we can actually study these things, in particular to have a systematic characterization of how these pointers map into whatever patterns they bring into the physical world. And this is using the tools of synthetic biology, and in particular synthetic bioengineering, where, for example, we can make beings like xenobots, like anthrobots, and all these other things that have behaviors, patterns of anatomy and physiology and so on, that have never been shaped by selection, because they've never existed in that configuration, right? And so now we have to start to ask, so where do they, if you can't blame it on eons of selection, where do their patterns come from? Mm-hmm. So that's it. Now we're to the point where we can actually not just sort of philosophically consider these things, but actually do some work and say, okay, what does that give us? Can we start to characterize that space of patterns? Can we start to understand the mapping between the pointers that we create, be they embryos, the hybrids, xenobots, computers, whatever else it is? What is the mapping between them and the patterns that they give us access to?
Yeah. So in terms of trying to even begin to understand what those things could be pointing to, and you started to mention what those pointers are. Things like xenobots, anthrobots, whatever you're using in your experiments. But Matt, you in one of the dialogues I've seen between you and Mike previously have said this, that his work is kind of like a pointer, or no, I think you said it's like a periscope into this hidden realm, or this realm of forms, or something like that. And you, as someone who is mostly a scholar, I don't know if you're mostly a scholar of Whitehead, but you're deeply read in Whitehead and you reference him often. I guess to start, what really piques your interest about Mike's work, and how is it a periscope into this hidden realm of forms that not only Whitehead would talk about, but of course Plato before him would talk about?
Yeah. Well, I've always been very interested in trying to understand the human mind and the natural world out of which the human mind has evolved or emerged, in a way that allows us to feel like that's not a miracle, that minds could come out of nature. And so the fact that there are human scientists who can study the natural world and discover these laws and these patterns, to me, says something not only about the human mind, but about nature. And, I think one of the first examples I heard Mike offer of sort of the approach he's taking to his work is he's trying to understand how we start as this little packet of physics and chemistry, the fertilized egg, and develop into, he used the example of Descartes usually, right? And so here's this philosopher in the 16th, 17th century who develops this dualism, who himself started as a fertilized egg in his mother's womb. And so somehow contemporary biology, especially as Mike has developed it, developmental biology, forces us to overcome that dualism. And so we as human beings, we can explore possible forms in our imagination. Where does that capacity come from? And what I find so exciting about Mike's work is the way he's rethinking the process of evolution, not just as this sort of search through genetic microstates via random mutation that then would get selected for, and instead seeing evolution as a process that is selecting for better and better agency, and that agency is always a function of collectives. It's like a swarm intelligence, and rather than evolution having to wait to accidentally find the right genetic mutation that then leads to this phenotype or anatomical form, there seems to be some degree of agency, which is this capacity, just like we in our imaginations can search possible forms. Cells and cellular collectives are searching possible forms and making decisions that are not merely mechanical, I would say. Now, I know another thing that Mike's doing that's really shaking things up is trying to bring the organicist tradition and the mechanistic tradition together in a way by creating one continuum where maybe there are simple machines on the far end and then Descartes on the other end, or maybe some other forms of superintelligence that we don't even imagine yet. And I think that that's an interesting challenge. A lot just depends on how we define the difference between a machine and an organism. But I think what talking about Platonic morphospace does in the context of developmental biology is it allows us to take seriously what was forbidden since around Descartes' time in science, namely talking about formal causality and final causality, which is to say purpose, agency, and the exploration of form in a way that's not simply about the accumulation of parts, but that there's a kind of wholeness that's operative that isn't dominating over the parts, but something emerges in these cellular collectives, say, that allows them to communicate globally, at least at the level of the whole organism, or at least the whole tissue, so as to achieve an anatomical form without any individual cell knowing or even being able to perceive that form.
Yeah.
Right. And so formal causality is this ability to manifest a kind of patterns of wholeness. And final causality is this agency that's operative. And those forms of causality were ruled out of biology and physics for most of the history of modern science. And I think, Mike, your work is allowing us to experimentally and empirically show how these sorts of ideas are necessary to explain what we're witnessing in the lab, right? And to help us explain what goes on in the evolutionary process all around us and within us, right? And so breaking down this barrier between mind and matter and recognizing matter as agential material. I love these phrases that Mike's throwing out. It really does help us understand how human minds are possible, in how science is possible in a natural world now that we can understand as purposeful, as guided by form, and not just guided by a kind of what we would call efficient causes, where there's just like a push from behind.
Yeah.
Right. There's more going on in the natural world that allows us as human beings to feel more at home here. Right. And so Mike's work, I think, has been a source of ongoing inspiration for me as a philosopher, trying to think beyond dualism.
Yeah. Yeah, it really forces questions about teleology, about obviously form, like we're talking about. Like, if it's not a push from behind, and we're, I guess, for a lot of people, resurrecting this idea of like a teleological bend or something in reality that is driving, or at least massaging circumstances, or I don't know. I don't know how we want to think about it, but I guess I'll just pose that as the next question: is what do you think the most sophisticated or plausible way to think about it is? Obviously, I know for you, Matt, you like Whitehead's interpretation, and it sounds to me like the two of you are probably on the same page as far as that goes. But yeah, I'll leave it at that. I'll leave it open ended.
So,
like, how do you think about whatever it is that is not just pushing from behind, but what is pulling towards some kind of teleological end? Because obviously that immediately brings into questions, questions about God, questions about some kind of you know design, things like that.
right.
But that's a no-go for many scientists, obviously.
Yeah, no, I think Mike and I both agree, if I'm not mistaken, that we want to bring form and finality or purpose back into biology without uh, resorting to any kind of design paradigm, like what William Paley, who Darwin
Yeah.
studied with, had this idea of, like living organisms are akin to finding a watch on a beach, and you see how apparently designed
Yeah.
it seems, and so you reason backwards to a designer who would exist prior to and outside of this process of uh, natural process, and impose form from the outside and impose purpose from the outside. And I think we want to avoid that avenue to formal and final causality. The thing about Darwin is, he's understanding form primarily as a function of descent. So
Hmm.
why do organisms have the anatomy they do, the phenotypes they do? Well, they've inherited that from ancestors, and the forms are sort of uh, from a strict Darwinian point of view, just a result of what happened to be to maximize survival for that lineage over the course of time. And so form is explained in terms of descent. And obviously, there is some degree to which we inherit forms from past ancestors, but that doesn't really explain the origin of form. And you begin to get a sense of the role that agency can play in biology from Darwin's account of not just natural selection, which is this descent account, but sexual selection. Then all of a
Hmm.
sudden, the agency of organisms becomes more important. And I think, in thinking of the role of evolution as the selection of agency or agential materials that already have all these competencies seemingly independent of, or at least not in a way reducible to the genetic equipment that they have. It's granting um, another account to the emergence. It's giving us another way of accounting for the emergence of form, which would have to do with the decisions made by cells and by cellular collectives to actualize the possibilities that are latent in this Platonic morphospace.
Hmm.
And so when we try to understand mind in this naturalistic way and its role in evolution, I think what and this is a kind of Whiteheadian approach here, mind is this capacity to search adjacent possibilities in this morphospace. And where is the mind? Well, it's not just in one cell. uh, Mind seems to be something that is realized in these uh, swarms of agents, and the decisions that are made are always collective decisions. It's a kind of democratic process, you could almost say.
Hmm.
Um, and whenever those cellular democracies fall out of coherence, you get things like cancer, you get mutations and whatnot. But it seems like a lot of the time, coherent decisions can be made to actualize forms that prove useful in the environments that those cellular collectives are in. And I think this is a mind like, or why not? Why just pretend like we're using an analogy here? This is a mental type of process. It's
Yeah.
a cognitive type of process that's operative. That is, again, not just like what human minds are doing. It is what human minds are doing. Um, the human mind being a collective of um, neurons. But I think also what's so important about Mike's work, and it's not that, Mike discovered this, but is really emphasizing the fact that all cells um, are capable of holding this voltage and communicating through bioelectric fields. And in some sense, what neurons do is just a further specialization of what every cell can do.
Hmm.
Um, right. And so mind is everywhere in a
Yeah.
way. So I
Yeah.
don't know if that's an explanation, but that's how I think of it. It's adding to Darwin's account of
Yeah.
form as just a matter of descent, that actually form is also something that these agents, cellular collective agency, can, Whitehead's word would be ingress. Like
Mm.
there's a searching function, and you can decide what would be the most helpful form to ingress next, given the conditions that we're in.
Yeah. Yeah, it certainly opens up a lot when you start to, bring in ideas like panpsychism. You're removing this problem of, uh blind sorts of groping that lead to unbelievably complex, harmonized, successful organisms. Like that's a huge hurdle to climb. And then you bring something in like, no, there's agency from the top all the way down. That certainly does explain a lot, but it still leaves the question of where does the higher form itself come from, and how does the interaction between the higher form and then the things that are operating from the bottom up to follow the form, like how, I mean, I guess this is probably a question more for Mike, is how does that interaction take place? And it still sort of leaves the question of like, where is the form coming from? And you could probably give specific examples of this in your work, Mike, how you see, you know, the form and then the things growing into the form.
What I'd like to do is I'll say a couple things about some themes that Matt just picked up, and then we can get to what you just asked. So one thing I want to say is that this issue of explaining things in biology, and it's definitely important to explain things, but the thing about just explaining is that something happens, or someone prepares an interesting experimental system, and then you try to give an explanation for it. This is an important piece of it, but it's not the only piece. It's limited because when you do that, it's always possible to look at whatever this is, go down at the lowest possible level. So people love chemistry, and they sort of pick up chemistry as and then not real reductionism, because nobody wants to talk about quantum foam, but they say chemistry. And they say, okay, so yeah, nothing to see here. It's just chemistry doing what chemistry does. It's just the low level rules of chemistry. And what they're saying is, yes, it's consistent with the laws of chemistry. But what I like about ideas is not just their ability to explain what's already happened, but to point into the future and to help you discover the next great thing. Right. Mm-hmm. So this to me is really critical, because these ideas that we're kicking around here, it's not the question to me isn't, are they the only thing that can explain things that exist in biology? Because no, the reductionists will rightly point out that, well, if I were to track all the particles, I would tell you what's going to happen. That isn't it. It's not about explaining backwards the interesting things that somebody's already found. The question is, does this worldview help you find the next insight, the next great thing? And just as a very simple example, you can think about something like the game of life, the cellular automaton. So you can be a reduction, right? You can be a reductionist about the game of life, and you can say, look, there are no gliders, there are no beehives, there's nothing except the rules that turn each little pixel on or off. That's it. And you're not exactly wrong, right? From the physics of the world, that's true. And if you follow that, you can, in fact, roll the thing forward and see what's going to happen from every given step. But what you're not going to do, if you don't believe in these higher levels of organization and you don't believe in gliders and things like that, if you're locked into that micro scale, what you're not going to do is design a Turing machine, for example, or a computer in the life world that uses gliders as a way to pass information. It is not facilitative of future discoveries. It's not that you're exactly wrong looking backwards. When somebody else makes the interesting machine, you could say, oh, I see how this works. It's following these three rules of the game of life. True enough. But why didn't you make the interesting machine, right? Because it doesn't facilitate that. So that's just the first thing I want to say, that it's not just about inventing, explaining things that already exist. It's about having theories that actually help you find the next interesting thing. And it becomes really important because sometimes, when we show off some of these things that we've discovered, and I want to be clear, it's not just me, right? I have a lab full of amazing people that work on this stuff. So we show these things, and somebody says, "Oh, yeah, that's cool, but you should stop talking about all this philosophical stuff. You don't need it. You don't need any of this, any of these ideas. Just do the experiments." And that, of course, doesn't work, because the reason we were able to do these experiments and somebody else didn't do them, decades earlier, is precisely because of these ideas. So that's the first thing. I want these ideas to be generative of new discoveries. The other thing I want to pick up just for a second is this notion of agency and intelligence and evolution and things like this. The problem, I think, that's been around for the longest time is that we have sort of two major views on it, and both of them really have bought into what I think is a fundamental problem, which is they've bought into there's only two positions on the intelligence scale. You can be completely blind and random and dumb like rocks, or you can be smart like humans and angels and various other things that people talk about. That's it. And so then you can have this big debate. Either evolution is completely blind, or it's got this master plan that's like this, this human or God level master plan. The thing is that we now understand, and I think this is really important, that with the work on cybernetics and diverse intelligence and many other things, that no, there's actually a very smooth gradation of different kinds of problem solving capacities, different kinds of intelligence, and a given process doesn't need to be completely dumb, nor does it need to be as smart as a human or level or above with forward capacity, forward planning and all these things. There are many spots in between. And so I think what actually is happening with evolution is that because the material itself, and we've done a lot of simulations on this, and I've written some very specific things on this, because the material itself is agential, meaning that you're not dealing with passive matter, you're dealing with material that has agendas, learning competencies, simple goal directedness in terms of homeostatic and homeodynamic loops. Because the material has a degree of intelligence, the process as a whole also works completely differently than evolution would work over a passive material. And it's not because there's I don't think there's any good evidence for some sort of very large scale forward planning top down control over it. It's not bad, but neither is it completely dumb. And it's okay to have an intermediate position, because we know now that there are many different ways of being intelligent, and some of them are low on the spectrum, some are high. But I think evolution works very differently because of the material, and fundamentally, and this is a whole long story we could get into, but because biological material is fundamentally unreliable. Okay. Mm-hmm. Unlike so modern computing, you have the separation of layers where if you're programming in a high level language, you don't need to worry about the copper. You don't need to think that, oh man, the silicon is gonna melt down. You assume all the levels underneath are working perfectly, and then you can sort of ignore them. Biology from the beginning doesn't work like that, because you never know exactly how many copies of anything you're going to have. You're going to get mutated over time. The environment's going to change. Things degrade. It's really working with an unreliable medium. And because from the very beginning it had to develop life, maybe primitive life to do that, but nowadays certainly the only life forms we see, it doesn't make, I don't think it makes fixed solutions to various problems. I think it makes problem solving agents at all scales. Molecular networks, cells, tissues, organs, all of these things are solving problems. They are not fixed solutions selected for a fixed environment. I mean, some organisms are more so than others, but all of them are fundamentally problem-solving agents. And this is what allows the system, yes, frog eggs make frogs and dog eggs make puppies and so on, but that's the default. That's what happens under default scenarios. One of the things that I love to point out these examples in various reviews and things, there are many, many examples, including the things that we've done with standard human cells making anthrobots and standard frog cells making xenobots, where under slightly different conditions, these same cells will find a new solution that has never been under selection. That I don't know what Darwin would have said about anthrobots and their capacities, which have never been selected. In that there is no human stage of development that looks like that. There are no anthrobots in our history, as far as we know. So all of those things happen. Because under novel circumstances, the living material is very good at finding ways to solve problems in different circumstances, using their genetically produced affordances, their molecular mechanisms in different ways. I mean, that's basically the definition of intelligence. This is why when we make a tadpole with an eye on its tail instead of in its head, and that eye connects to the gut, the spinal cord, or nowhere, those animals can still see. And that works out of the box. No new rounds of selection and mutation and needed. Out of the box, it works, right? And I have dozens and more examples of this kind of stuff. And it works because the system never assumed that the eyes were going to be in a specific location in the first place. It looks to us like it did, because most of the time it's the same starting position and everything's the same. But once you start perturbing it, you immediately find out that it didn't make that assumption. It was ready to roll on all kinds of different ways of being a tadpole. And so what we have here then, I think, is that the genome and the information in the genome is not taken literally by the process of embryonic or regenerative morphogenesis. It's some parts of it provide structural proteins and things that are affordances that can be used, but overall, I see it more as more of a prompt, right? I see it more of as information that has to be interpreted creatively in the current moment, right? And so the allegiance is not to the past meaning of information or how your ancestors dealt with it or anything like that, because you're different, because you've been mutated. The environment is different. Everything is different. Your job is to interpret that information as best as you can to do something useful with it. And so that's what I think is going on there, is that it's not a direct hardwired instructive information that tells you what to do. They're like your memories, they have to be interpreted on the fly. And just the very last thing is about bioelectricity. So yeah, bioelectricity is awesome, but bioelectricity is not actually required for any of the things I'm talking about. Bioelectricity is a super convenient example of it. And we know, because the brain exploits it, and actually the rest of the body does too. It works as a really good cognitive glue, meaning that it binds individual cells into networks that can have a larger cognitive bigger goal. They can pursue bigger goals, making limbs and organs instead of little tiny cell level goals. So yeah, it's a great cognitive glue, but there are many other mechanisms of cognitive glue, like stress sharing and many other things. And so it is not as if everything that I'm saying here is somehow pinned on the data on bioelectricity. Bioelectricity is just a very convenient way to show how these ideas can become experimentally tested and then actual useful therapeutics. And so that's what we've been doing. But it's not in and of itself magic. Is what does provide the magic is cognitive glue mechanisms that allow parts to align themselves in a way that pull down bigger, more sophisticated, more interesting patterns in from the whether you call it Platonic space or something else, but from the latent space of possibilities that the individual parts couldn't have pulled down alone. That's it. And bioelectricity is great at that, but so are other things.
I want to get more into the Platonic morpho space, but for the sake of the audience who, this is every day for you. So xenobots, anthrobots, all this stuff, bioelectricity, this is every day. But for a lot of the audience, it isn't. So let's just linger on what they are, how you use them. And you've already alluded to some of the things that you've been able to do, like, like move eyeballs from where they belong to the tail, and it still works. So let's just start there.
Okay, well, so then just, I guess, a couple of brief definitions.
Yeah.
So think about the conventional story of intelligence. So here we are, you and I. What makes us not just a pile of neurons? And because if you look inside, we're basically a big pile of neurons and other cells. But what makes us more than that is this kind of cognitive glue. It's the ability of these cells to share information in networks that can store much larger kinds of memories that the individual cells can alone. And they can own, so the collective can own goals, memories, preferences, and various other things that cannot belong to any of the parts. Like if you have a rat, and you train the rat to press a lever and get a delicious reward, no individual cell in that rat has both experiences. The cell at the bottom of the feet, it touches the lever. The cells in the gut receive the reward. Well, who owns the associative memory that the one is linked to the other? No individual cell has it. The rat has it. And the reason the rat has it is because it's got this amazing neural system that binds those, aligns and binds those components towards goals, memories, and preferences, and so on, that the individual parts don't have. So in the brain, we know that this is largely an electrophysiological network that has that job. And so you might ask, well, where did that come from? Where did these amazing tricks of the brain come from, including mental time travel, so remembering and forecasting things that aren't happening right now, right? And integrating information across your whole body and across time. Where did that happen? Well, it turns out that both the mechanisms and the policies by which that happens are extremely ancient. So sometime around the start of bacterial biofilms, this was already happening. Bacterial biofilms already are using electrical networks to form a kind of early multicellularity to do this. And then from there we get into real multicellularity and embryonic development, because in morphogenesis, just imagine, visualize an early embryo. Let's say it's an amnio, like a human or a bird. It's a flat sheet of cells, maybe 50,000 cells. We look at that and we say, there's one embryo. what are we counting when we say it's one embryo? What is there one of? I mean, you're looking at 50,000 cells, and then each one of those, inside each one of those is all kinds of other stuff. So what are you counting when you say one embryo? What you're really counting is a kind of alignment. It's alignment in the sense that all of those cells are working together towards one particular region of anatomical morphospace. And anatomical morphosity is just the space of all possible configurations, giraffes and snakes and trees and everything else. It's just a space of possible anatomical ways to be shaped. And so all of those cells are working together to reach one specific region of that space and become whatever it is that they're supposed to become. In effect, it's a very cognitive kind of alignment, because they've all bought into the same story of where to go in anatomical space. And what allows them to do that is a communication network that's partially electrical, partially chemical, partially biomechanical, and it allows them to form a network that has a map of that space and some set point in that space where basically the closer they get to that space, the lower their overall stress becomes, and so they're moving to that location. So that's what bioelectricity is. Bioelectricity is it's not about applied fields or any of that. It's the important thing about bioelectricity is that it allows subunits to form a large network that can have a goal-directed activity towards states that are way too big for any individual. Mm-hmm. Right? So when you have a salamander, if it loses an arm, those cells will work really quickly. They'll rebuild the limb, and then they stop. They stop because they've reached the goal. And so the collective knows what a salamander limb is supposed to look like, and it stops when it gets there. The individual cells have no idea what a finger is or how many fingers you're supposed to have, but they're held together in terms of, so now this gets back to the theme you were talking about before about the teleology of it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Right. Absolutely. They're held together by a representation of what it is that they're building. And so now this is key. One of the things that we've been working on and for years now, and this is something that was originally proposed many years ago by a guy named Harold Burr back in the 30s, is this idea that the shape of embryos and of regenerating limbs and everything else isn't just an emergent outcome of a open loop process where these simple rules get activated and eventually something complex happens. I mean, that certainly does happen. There is, this emergence of complexity certainly does occur. But what he was saying is that actually, and people before that, but he was particularly thinking about this in bioelectrical terms, that basically the tissue is operating specifically towards an encoded final set point that it's trying to reach. Okay, what's important about that is that it makes a very specific prediction. Like your thermostat, to say that your thermostat stores a particular goal that it is trying to reach, so it has a goal. There's only one way to test it, which is, well, let's rewrite the goal and see what happens. Okay, so in order to make a claim like this, that the thing is teleological, you have to be able to find the encoding of the set point. You have to decode it. You have to be able to change it and show that by changing that set point, now the system is chasing a different goal. Right? That's how you can find teleology. You don't find it by assuming it. Of course, you also can't banish it by assuming it doesn't exist. You have to do experiments. And so we have shown, exactly as Burr predicted, that in many of these cases there is literally a bioelectric pattern memory that precedes and drives the behavior of the cells towards a specific outcome. For individual cells, it's from their perspective, it's just a bunch of voltage gradients, and they do what cells do, is they behave in specific ways according to specific gradients. Because they at that level they don't have access to the whole plan of what's going on. But the cellular collective, to the collective, that pattern is a memory, exactly the same way as it's a memory to brainy organisms when they're going to go and get whatever their goal is of wherever they're going. So to the collective, it is a memory, and they're pursuing goal directed behavior towards that memory, and that means rearranging their parts to get the error down as well as you can. So that's the magic of bioelectricity, is simply that it is an amazingly good way to bind the pieces together towards a collective that can store larger patterns. And in my framework, the size of the goals you can maintain is known as the cognitive light cone. The cognitive light cone demarcates what are, in space and time, what are the biggest goals that you can entertain. And what life loves to do is to scale up that cognitive light cone. And bioelectricity is one method for taking a bunch of parts and making sure that the collective has larger cognitive light cone that projects into, for example, anatomical space instead of the physiological and the metabolic space that individual cells try to operate in.
Xenobots and anthrobots. Do you want to riff on
Yeah.
those two?
Right. Okay. Basically, I'll just talk about the anthrobots. It's kind of the more recent thing is if you so sometimes I give and I'll provide a video that you can put up on the thing. Sometimes I give a talk where I started by showing a video, and this little thing with an interesting shape, and it's sort of running around and doing various things. It's a tiny little thing. It's probably a couple of hundred microns in diameter, but it moves on its own, and it's swimming around, and it has some interesting behaviors and properties. And I say to the audience, what do people think this is? And the standard thing you might say is, well, this looks like something you got off the bottom of a pond somewhere. It looks like a primitive organism. And I say, okay, well, based on what you're seeing, could you guess what the genome looks like? And you might guess that it has a genome similar to other very primitive organisms. Well, if you were to sequence it, you would find that it's actually Homo sapiens, 100% unedited normal human genome. Because what we've done, and this particular work was done by Gizem Pamushka, a PhD student from my group. What I wanted to do was try to unlock some of these unconventional behaviors from standard cells. No genetic editing, no weird nanomaterials, just the same old cells. Let's see if they're willing to reboot their multicellularity and do something new. So what we did was we took cells from adult human patients, no embryos, adult human patients donating their tracheal epithelia during biopsy samples and things like that. With these cells, you take them out now. Now, there's something interesting. The patient may or may not still be alive at this point. If not, these cells are having an interesting kind of second chance at life, but they don't know. And so what you do with them is you put them in a particular environment, and within a short time, they self-assemble into this round little thing that turns itself inside out. The outside now has these little hairs on it they're called cilia, and these little things that can spin, like paramecia have, and so on. And they use those little hairs to row against the water, and they start to swim, and they swim around. And they have some discrete types of behaviors that you could build an ethogram of which behaviors follow which other behaviors, like you would with an animal. And one of the cool things they do is if you plate a dish of human neurons, and you take a scalpel, you put a big scratch through that dish, right? So it's a wound in a neural tissue. You put the anthrobots into the dish. They sort of run around. If they find that scratch, they settle in the scratch. They work together. We call it a superbot cluster because there might be like 10 of them that kind of clump together. They sit there, and about 4 days later, you lift them up, and you see that what they were doing while they were sitting there is taking the two sides of the neural wound and healing them together.
Did those neurons have different genomes, or is it the same genome as the anthrobots?
They're the same species of genome, meaning it's human. Everybody's human, but the neurons typically don't come from the same patient. So the neurons come from IPS. I mean, they could. We could do it from the same patient.
But it doesn't need to be for them.
It absolutely does not need to be. No, when we did it, it was a completely heterologous human. So yeah. So now what you see, what they were doing is, and the important thing to point out about this is that this was not, test 102 of 1,000 things we tried. This was the first damn thing we tried. Okay. And this is what we found. Now just imagine, what else can they do that we're not even, and then of course this is what we're studying. We're studying various things, their ability to learn and all, preferences and whatnot. But here, like, who would have thought that your standard cells that sit there quietly in your airway for decades, when given a chance to reboot their multicellularity, would actually make a self-multi-little organism that doesn't look like any stage of human development, that's going to run around and do things like repair neural wounds. Looking at it now, somebody could say, well, yeah, I suppose, it's got cilia, and I suppose the cilia will row against the water, and maybe they're putting out some... Right. There will be some chemical story that's consistent with what's going on. But the reason you would do an experiment like this is precisely if you thought that actually these things are not, the human genome doesn't just make humans. It's a set of suggestions that can actually be interpreted in a number of other ways. And the work that preceded this was work on xenobots, where Doug Blackiston and our collaborators at the Vannevar lab at UVM, we took some early cells that were going to become epidermis, some skin from frog embryos, and we saw the same thing. that when you liberate it from the other cells of the embryo, which normally basically bully them into being this boring, like two-dimensional outer cover, keeping the bacteria out and things like that. When you get rid of all that, you find out what the cells really want to do by default. And if you do so without that behavioral control of the other cells, what they do is, again, they assemble into this little self-motile, this little round thing, and that has a bunch of behaviors, including kinematic replication. So that means when you give it loose, sprinkled cells in the environment, they go around and they collect those cells into little balls, which then mature into the next generation of xenobots. So it's a way of making copies, right? It's kind of like von Neumann's dream of making a machine that makes copies of itself from materials that are finds in the environment. So again, to our knowledge, there's never been kinematic replication in any lineage. It's not something that any other animal does. We've made it impossible for these animals to replicate in the normal froggy lifestyle. So there's a different way that they could do it, and it's not, it's not full on replication. For example, it doesn't have strong heredity, so offspring don't look more like their parents than they do like random xenobots. So it's just kind of it's a kind of replication. It's not like a full reproductive evolutionary cycle, but it's a simple form of it. And again, this is something that was completely not obvious. If you had a frog genome and you've been watching frogs for some number of years, and you think that frogs are a solution to eons of a froggy environment, you wouldn't really say that you could actually get xenobots and kinematic replication. That's it's and there we get back to my first point about discovery. You make a lot of new discoveries with the idea that no, it's actually a problem solving process that takes the genome seriously, but not literally, so to speak.
Yeah, now we're getting into some juicy stuff. We're getting into, self-assembly. We're getting into the fact that just by removing cells from their native environment, they figure out how to become this new thing. And they, for some reason, have a bend toward wanting to rush to a wound healing role. I got to kick the ball to Matt. Where does all that bring you? What all of seeing that these aren't just theoretical ideas, but these are, I mean, I don't want to put ideas in your head, but to me, this definitely seems to speak directly to some of what Whitehead talks about.
Yeah. Well, I think, a lot of what Mike's talking about here is, stuff I read in a paper that he sent me just last night on what he's calling self-improvising memory, and thinking of memory, whether we're talking about, genetic memories or anatomical memories or, our own human memories, we're always recreating them in the present. And so rather than thinking of them, as these static traces or something, Mike was using this term mnemonic improvisation. Memories are more like these dynamic processes that are being recreated again and again in the present as they are relevant to the present. And so genes, it seems like, are more like, mnemonics that cells can use in an improvisatory way. And, the metaphor of genes as a language has been used for a long time. And I think that still works, but we have to really follow that analogy through, like language at the level of human beings. We don't think of letters or words or sentences as like being in the driver's seat. There needs to be an interpreter of that language. And so in some sense, the genes are the cell's way of, having a mnemonic to help it remember certain tricks that have worked in the past, certain proteins that prove useful for different problems. But that genome is, it's not about maintaining fidelity. It's about maintaining salience, which means very often to the extent that the genome remains a faithful copy, it's because the cell is doing a lot of work to repair it, right? And similarly, the environment is cueing the cell to draw on aspects of its genome that weren't active before. And so it's very much putting the cell in the driver's seat rather than the genome, as though the genome is some kind of blueprint or some kind of program. And I think this tells us also something about how to think about form in biology rather than, there's been a kind of Platonism operative in molecular biology, I would say. Whenever there's talk of the genes coding for a phenotype, there's a kind of covert Platonism going on there. Like there's the ideal form in the genome, and then there's this attempt of the phenotype to kind of uh, manifest that in physical space. But the kind of Platonism that Mike seems to be pointing to is not so much about what's stored in the genome, but about what's stored in this. You could call it a space of possibility. I almost think it's better to refer to it as a topos, like it's a topology, um, in the sense that it's when we use the term space, we make it seem like it's like out there waiting for us to discover it, and I would want to avoid that, and instead think of a kind of a continuum of possibility. Let's say that organisms are searching, and the question that I would want to ask, and this is where Whitehead would come in, is that, we want to understand not just what organisms have done in the past, which we can offer explanations of what's gone on in the past. And, Mike saying, well, what about not just, what have organisms done in the past? What can organisms do in the future? Which is part of what these anthrobot experiments are searching for. But the question from a Whiteheadian point of view is that continuum of possibility, or that Platonic morphospace, as Mike refers to it, in any way like tilted or graded such that there is some kind of um, uh,
and
ordering of that space, right? That it's not like design stamped from above by some kind of a creator god, but rather uh, a, a way in which the possibilities are made relevant to one another, so as to realize higher and higher values, let's say, as that space is, or that continuum of possibility is explored by organisms, right? And so it's a question of whether there might not be, it's not a push from behind, it's not a creator reaching in to design from beyond, but there's a kind of lure from up ahead towards those forms which would be most valuable for realization in the present.
This also, just to throw this in there, kind of reminds me of the Platonic idea of necessity too. You know how like in the myth of toward the end of Plato's Republic, there's this whole, I won't get into that whole story, but there's this whole story essentially about how uh, somebody goes through this near death experience, and they see the whole architecture of the afterlife and reincarnation and all of this stuff. But what it points to is there's this sort of three pronged nature to reality that is something from above, that is like inherited through whatever. In the case of this myth, it's inherited from above through like spiritual means, but let's just say it's inherited from something else. Then there's the organism itself, which has some level of agency, but then there's this third factor of necessity. And they talk about this like factor of necessity as this, I guess, just reality that exists, and without like, as almost like an archetype. Like necessity itself exists as an archetype, just like the idea of self and other exist as sort of inescapable um archetypes, at least in a Platonic sense. But that you bringing up this idea of tilting, that it just seems like this is the way things need to be for whatever reason, that reminded me of that sort of archetypal idea of necessity that's played with.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like fractals are beautiful to us, right? And so there seems to be something, some kind of aesthetic ordering to the space of possibility
Yeah.
that is acting as a lure for evolution. And so we can think of, explanations of form in the biological world just in terms of descent and inheritance. But clearly, life is doing more than repeating the past. It's creatively adapting in the present to novel circumstances. And so we can also think about desire for new forms, not just descent of old forms. And what is the function of desire, and how is it able to search this space, this Platonic morphospace, or this continuum of possibility, in a way that leads it to very quickly discover valuable adjacent possibilities, right? It doesn't have to go through many generations of mutations to like find that. Like these anthrobots are able to find ways of becoming motile. Like there's nothing in their genes other than it maybe deep ancestral memories of how, oh, now we're one cell again. Okay, I remember how to do this. And so there's a way in which, they used to say ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which is to say, as you go through the morphogenetic stages of development to get to a human being, you're passing through these ancient forms of, prior ancestors of, the fish and the amphibian and the kind of reptile forms, where at an earlier stage of development, you can't really tell organisms apart, whether they're birds or reptiles or human beings. Like we seem to go through the same stages. And so these pathways through morphospace are, you don't want to just think of it as the adult form, that there's a whole sequence of forms that we have to pass through, that you're talking about necessity. It's like, to get to the human form, you have to pass through these earlier stages first, because that's the trajectory through the morphospace to get to the actualized form that's valuable to you, right? And so when we talk about the tilting or the ordering of the possibilities in this continuum or this morphospace, that's a source of, it's not design, but it's a source of order that I do think needs some explanation.
Right.
It's not as though evolution is proceeding through just random sampling. There is that going on, but there also seems to be these pathways that are more desirable than other pathways. And once those are achieved, evolution tends to continue to exploit them. And it could be that we just get locked down a path, but why was the path chosen to begin with? Like the vertebrate path, this body plan that has been exploited by various types of organisms that has proven so valuable. I think one experiment that we haven't been able to do yet would involve finding life on another planet and seeing, okay, does it go down similar pathways? Would we also find something like vertebrates as a very successful form of organism on other planets, or is it going to look completely different? As soon as we have another example of life, I think we'll get a much better sense immediately of the extent to which there might be some grading or tilting or some order or organization to the way that these possible forms relate to each other. Right?
Yeah, a couple of things. First of all, on the alien life, I mean, absolutely. But we should note that in the meantime, we have the next best thing, which is synthetic morphoengineering. So we can take anthrobots and put in some nerve cells and ask, what does a central nervous system architecture look like in a creature that's never existed before, right? So the cells have evolutionary continuity, but the overall large scale shape does not. So it's nowhere on the tree of life with us. So not quite alien, but close, in the sense that it is just simply not a continuity of past selection forces. It's a completely different configuration. So that's one thing. Another thing I want to talk about is this, and so I'm going to say a bunch of stuff that is kind of how I'm thinking about it now. I have no clue whether this is really what Plato was thinking or what Whitehead was thinking. I have no idea. So this is just what I'm thinking now, and you can tell me if this matches anything else. The first thing is that I do think that it's important to think about it as an existing space that is out there in an important sense and has structure. Maybe it's tilted, maybe it's not, but I do want to say that it's ordered and it has structure, because otherwise what happens is, and this is how most people I think tackle this problem, they don't want to think about a non-physical space existing. They want to be minimal and minimalist and so on. And when they run across interesting features, whether they be mathematics or surprising properties of networks or something else, they say, wow, well, that's a fact that holds. They say that is a fact that holds in our universe. And the problem there is, so the benefit is okay, well, it's a kind of a minimalist thing, so you've avoided having a space of forms, fine. But what you've given up then is the following. You now are committed to a random grab bag of facts that hold, that you will come across from time to time, and you will be surprised, and you will write them down, and you'll call it emergence, right? Which sounds like we've understood something, but really it's a catalog of facts that hold. And I think that's a very Mysterian defeatist position. I don't think we should go into it thinking that there's just going to be a random bunch of emergent surprises for us, and when they show up, we catalog them and sort of marvel at how cool it is, and that's the end of that until the next one shows up. I think, consistent with the rest of the scientific enterprise, we ought to say that, okay, these are emergent facts, and much like what the mathematicians do when they build a map of mathematics, these things come from an ordered space. And we can now have a principled, systematic investigation of that space by building various pointers into that space, seeing what we get, and trying to map it out like we map out every other space. So I think it's important for methodological reasons. I mean, I can't prove that this is true, but neither can we prove that the world is understandable at all. But we sort of assume that to get on with our science. I think we have to assume that it's not just a random collection of emergent surprises that hold, but actually an ordered space that we can wander through by the artifacts that we make, and by the thinking that we do. So that's one thing. And another thing I want to suggest, yeah, please. Although I can't hear you, I think you might be muted.
Okay, you must have muted.
Just to clarify the two positions that you're demarcating there, there's this one position that all that nature is a series of emergent facts. And then there's this other position that, well, there are also eternal forms, or these patterns that are there in this space of adjacent possibilities that can become facts, but they don't already exist as facts. They exist now just as possibilities. And the evolutionary process, which is an accumulation of facts, is also, as it were, carving its way into this Platonic space of possibilities. And those possibilities have definite relationships to one another, mathematical, logical, and otherwise, that can be exploited, such that, you pull one little piece of the possibility into the actual world, and you get the whole rest of that relationship. Like, you use the example of the triangle. Once you have the two sides, the third side's there for free. There are a lot of forms like that, that when they get actualized, there's a kind of leap that occurs, that doesn't require random searching to piece it together, right? And so either the one position would be nature is just, and evolution is just the accumulation of emergent facts. And then what you seem to be suggesting is, yes, that's occurring, but there's also a relationship between what's been actualized and what remains possible, right? So there's actualized facts and eternal forms, and the relationship among all those forms that can inform the process of actualization. And now what's interesting is I've heard people refer to this more Platonic position as Mysterian, but you're saying actually it's this position that it's only emergent facts that's Mysterian, because it can't make sense of this order for free and the adjacent possible that continues to show up in evolution. So we're both calling each other, both sides are calling the other Mysterian, because there's clearly something surprising going on here. And it just seems, I just wanted to note that difference, because it's a very exciting moment in science as we, I think, break into a new paradigm in the largest sense of a return to, again, formal and final causality as being considered something naturalistic, but we're all still trying to work out the details here, right?
Yeah, no, exactly right. And I think the reason people call these ideas Mysterian is because they make the assumption that they're very committed to physicalism, and they make the assumption that once you've posited a non-physical world, you're down to mysteries and we'll never know. And that's a completely unwarranted assumption. I'm sure the mathematicians would be shocked to find out that they actually have no job to do now, because they're the things that they discover are not part of the pantheon of physics. And so and the same for us. I mean, I know it's not a Mysterian position because I have a lab full of people doing actual experiments, spending money, buying chemicals and doing things that are directly testing some of these ideas. So to me, the Mysterian position is not whether you're a physicalist or not. That's just a very constraining assumption that we don't need to make. The Mysterian position is, do you know what your next experiment is? And if you don't know what your next experiment is, and if you don't know how the various facts that hold are actually connected to each other, and you're just sort of hanging around until you find the next surprising one, that's the mysterious position. The question is the question is, how are you going to find the next one? And in many of these cases, we know how we're going to find the next one, because we're actually trying to work out the mapping between the pointers that we make and the things that they point to. But yes, I think I agree. It's a flip of how people have been thinking about it. I think there's one other interesting pivot that we should make, which is that you mentioned this idea of life forms looking for these patterns and so on. And it's something that I've been working on a lot recently, about this distinction between who's the machine and who's the data. Okay, who's the agent and what are the patterns? And I want to flip it slightly. Let's think of it this way. What if it's not that there are physical beings that are looking for patterns they're trying to find? What if we look at it from the perspective of the pattern? And the reason I'm saying that is because my view of this Platonic space is, or whatever space it is, that it has the things that we're used to, boring facts about triangles and prime numbers and things like that. These are low agency kinds of patterns. But it also has much higher agency kind of patterns, which for example, kinds of minds, I think, are actually specific patterns in that space. And then I can even name some things that are in between, because you might wonder, well, what could possibly be between those two things? And I can name some things if you want to talk about that. But basically, the idea is that some of these patterns are what we would consider very low agency things, the way people think about rocks and things like this. But others are active or even cognitive, and thus it makes sense to ask, from the perspective of these patterns, what does the world look like? And so you can sort of imagine, and this part is beyond specific experiments at this point. This is just how I try to visualize it. I think that in that space, which is ordered, which has various gradients in it, as you suggested, I think it's under positive pressure. I think that these patterns are trying, in the way that a gas in a balloon is trying to get out into the physical space. But the only way they can do that is through what Don Hoffman would call interfaces, or what I call pointers. So we build something that could be a physical triangle, or it could be a xenobot, or it could be a human embryo, or it could be a large language model, or it could be whatever it's going to be. And when we build these things, exactly as you just said, you get more out than you put in. You get more than what you just did, because you're not actually creating any of these behavioral and anatomical features. You are facilitating their appearance out of an ordered space in which for all practical purposes they're under positive pressure. That's how I kind of visualize this. And I think I think we really need to we've been tied up with this kind of Turing model, where you have a physical machine, and the machine is the agent, and it processes passive data. And so we've now been doing work on self-sorting arrays of data and physiological patterns that modify themselves and cause disease and so on, and thoughts, right? The symmetry between thoughts and thinkers, as William James had suggested, that it's not so obvious what's the thought and what's the thinker, and this idea that we of course are also patterns of a kind, right? We're a sort of temporary metabolic pattern that's held together for some amount of time. And all of these patterns in different media, thoughts in cognitive media, patterns in ecological media like us, hurricanes and all these kind of persistent, temporarily persistent dynamical objects. Patterns can be agents, and they can have their own first-person perspective, I think. And so I want to try to recast some of this, not as physical life searching for the space of patterns, but being able to look at it in a kind of a symmetrical way. Yeah, and we could talk about the array. I mean, so we have minimal models of some of this stuff with these self-sorting arrays and things like that, which gets into another discussion that Matt and I were having earlier about can we put machines on the same spectrum as some of these things. So we could talk about that. But one way I sometimes warm people up to some of these ideas because people think, no, it's obvious. I'm a tangible physical thing, and I may have patterns of thought, but those are not tangible. And this is how you might warm up to this. Imagine, I have a beautiful illustration of this made by John Rigay, our graphic artist. Imagine that out of the core of the earth, out of the center of the earth, come these creatures that live down there. They're unbelievably dense, from the core. So they're unbelievably dense. They come up. They have gamma ray vision because that's what you have to have down there to be able to see anything. So they come up. What do they actually see? So they're walking around. Well, the surface is kind of covered in this like very thin sort of plasma. They don't see any of the things that look like physical objects to us. They're so dense. All of this is like rarefied plasma to them. And one of them is a scientist, and so he's watching this plasma. He's got some equipment. He's watching the plasma, and he sees these, and he says to the others, "Say, I'm watching this like rarefied gas that's around our planet. It's got kind of patterns in it, and if you watch carefully, these patterns sort of look like they're doing something. I mean, they move around, they sort of come together, they come apart, they're doing something." They're almost like agential, these patterns. And the others say, well, that's crazy. We're real physical objects. Patterns in a gas can't be agents. And he says, well, they kind of look like they're doing something, and they seem to have goals. They have some ingenuity about, getting certain things accomplished. Well, how long do these patterns last? Well, about 100 years. Oh, that's nuts. Nothing interesting can happen that fast. So, right. So you can see what's going on here, right? It's a lot in the eye of the beholder. To one kind of observer, we are rapidly dissipating patterns, and it might be very hard to imagine that we have any kind of inner perspective or any kind of cognitive chops to us at all. And I think this is what's happening with a lot of the patterns we see: patterns in physiological events in living bodies, patterns in all kinds of other non-living media that. My gut feeling is that we have a lot of mind blindness. We're very poorly tuned to recognize cognitive patterns in things other than medium-sized objects moving at medium speeds through three-dimensional space. Anything else we don't really see. And so I think we really need to build tools and conceptual frameworks to extend our sort of native evolutionary firmware that is very like tunnel vision on this stuff, and think about different kinds of patterns as the agents. And so you can flip a lot of these computational metaphors as far as letting the data drive and looking at the machine, be it a computer or a living body that is actually the scratch pad of physiological patterns that then kind of like Stigmergy and ants, but they sort of leave marks and they modify their environment for themselves. You can imagine physiological patterns doing this in the body. The body is the tape of the Turing machine. The body can be the scratch pad, and it's the patterns of the physiological patterns of information that are actually, for example, like the bioelectric pattern memory that I talked about before. The rest of the body is just scratch pad for these kinds of things. So I think both. I'm not trying to replace the standard view, but I think both are valuable. I think we need to start really trying to figure out what things look like from the perspective of patterns in unconventional media, and then maybe we can tell a story about evolution from that perspective and see where that gets us. This is all very much work in progress. I'm not making any claims about any of this being useful yet, but this is the kind of stuff we're thinking about now.
This is super juicy, and I want to say that So one, I think for sure that this comports almost completely with Plato's view of reality. I think it also, to some degree, is why people like Roger Penrose consider themselves mathematical Platonists. He says, I think in Shadows of the Mind, like something to the effect of the Platonic realm of forms is a logical inevitability or something like that. And he has this, his whole triune model of reality of the sort of I think it's like the observer, the observed, and the Platonic realm of forms, but also going beyond like mathematical and rational inevitabilities. From my very high level understanding, it seems like this is where physics is headed too, with things like the discovery of these like deep structures, like the amplituhedron that Hoffman always talks about. This ironically something that almost looks like a Platonic solid that perfectly somehow captures all of the possibilities and like scattering events of particle collisions that normally would have taken like, hundreds and hundreds of pages of number crunching by a supercomputer. They somehow discovered this polytope that predicts the scattering events. So it does seem like there is some not other dimension, but hidden dimension endemic within reality that is exercising these, like behaving like attractors, or I don't know. I don't know. But this spawns a question for you, Matt, which is, I know there's some nuance between how Whitehead thought of forms and how Plato thought of forms. And you were just saying it before that Whitehead thought of them more as like potentials. But what does that really mean? Does it just mean that they don't exist in the physical realm, but have infinite potentials of how they can exert their force and manifest in the physical realm? Or does it mean they really don't have any kind of ontos, like they don't exist in any way? Because I can't quite wrap my mind around how it would be the latter.
Mm. Yeah. So the two main categories of Whitehead's metaphysics are actual occasions or actual occasions of experience, and eternal objects, which are his version of the Platonic forms.
Yeah.
And to have anything real and existent, you need both of these. And so actual occasions are what are concrete for Whitehead, and the eternal objects or the Platonic forms are how that concreteness is characterized, right? And so you're always dealing in reality with a synthesis of fact and form.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, though, what is the nature of that relationship and which is primary? And for Plato, it's clearly the forms that have preeminent actuality. And what we experience in the physical world from Plato's point of view would be a pale imitation.
Yeah.
Whitehead's inverting that picture and saying our actual experience of the physical world, you could say, though his conception of the physical world is quite different from the materialist conception of it. What's real, what has value, is our experience, but that experience is itself characterized in terms of these formal possibilities. And some forms we're inheriting from past experience, because there is this dimension of cosmic evolution from Whitehead's point of view that is about the accumulation of facts. But we don't just exist in the past, we always exist in the present. Actual occasions of experience are always concressing in the present, inheriting that accumulation of past facts, but also open to this future, which is characterized by these formal possibilities, right? And I loved what you were saying, Mike, about this morphospace being under pressure, being under positive pressure, because Whitehead would say that, as he refers to it, the realm of eternal objects, this realm of possibilities, is yearning for actualization.
Mm-hmm.
In and of itself, it's deficient in actualization, but it's yearning to come into contact with these actual occasions of experience that are concressing, is Whitehead's term, in the present, right? And so there's this pressure that's trying to meet so there's the yearning of the eternal, as Blake would say, eternity is in love with the productions of time, as a poetic way of rendering this. And so Whitehead's trying to find the right balance, right, between these actual occasions and these eternal objects. And he resorts to theological language here, but it's important, I think, to keep in mind that when he references the primordial nature of God, say, he's not speaking in a religious register there. He's really speaking as a metaphysician, and God is a concept that has a function in his scheme, which is precisely to give an ordering to that realm of eternal objects, to order that realm, to give it a sense of there are higher values and lower values, like more valuable forms to be realized and less valuable forms to be realized, or more relevant forms for what's occurring in the present and less relevant forms for what's occurring in the present. And he just thought, as a metaphysician, there needs to be some sort of eternal sorting function that would allow for there to be some sense of relevance for us as actual occasions in the present, some sense of relevant possibility. because if there were no sorting function or no divine function in his terms, his concern was there would be no way of accounting for the way in which we have as actual occasions in the present, we have some sense of the relevance of the ordering of these possibilities, right? If there were no way of establishing that relevance, we would just be faced with infinite possibility moment by moment, and it wouldn't be, those possibilities wouldn't be ordered among themselves.
Yeah.
And so he resorts to this divine function or this God concept to account for that. Maybe we don't need to do that. He was doing his best to remain in his metaphysics and his cosmology consistent with all the special sciences, with quantum relativity theories, with evolutionary biology, physiology. He wanted to be as naturalistic as possible, but as a metaphysician, he still thought to make sense of this relationship between actual facts and possible forms, there needs to be some sorting function, some valuer of the realm of possibility, which he called God. Right. And so maybe we need another name for that, or maybe there's another way to explain this procurement of relevance from the space of possibility. But that's the direction Whitehead went. And I think one of the doors that this opens for us is to, like Mike was saying, consider other seemingly agential patterns in nature as not just mind-like, but actually as minds. And so plasma dynamics is a great example. And as soon as you open the door to that and you look out at the universe and you see galaxies and you see stars and you see these other giant plasma clouds with these filaments, I mean, I know, Mike, you said it's not just that bioelectricity is the be all and end all, but there's something interesting about electricity that's operative at all scales in nature that maybe functioning as a kind of communication medium for these kinds of minds that we wouldn't have expected to see in the old paradigm. I love your term mind blindness, that we suffer from mind blindness. I think that's true. And these ways of thinking open the door to a totally new conception of the cosmos and how it organizes itself.
Just to interject for 1 second, I'm surprised he didn't go with logos there. I feel like everything you were talking about in terms of that sorting function, or the sort of, I guess, like innate way that systems seem to organize themselves, seems like logos. Does he actually,
would be a good word for that? Yeah.
Does he talk about logos?
He doesn't so much,
Okay.
you know. He talks about Eros, this other Greek term for desire, and divine Eros, and the way that does. That's one way of thinking about what organizes this realm of possibilities to make it relevant to actual occasions of experience. But yeah, he doesn't use the term logos, but that would be a perfect way to connect it with Neoplatonic and Stoic understandings of the principle of intelligibility operative in the cosmos.
When he talks about Eros, does he talk about it sort of like the end of the symposium where Socrates is talking about Eros as this sort of like intermediary binding kind of force? Interesting. Cool.
Exactly. So most of the Platonic, so there's three big Platonic ideas: the true, the good, and the beautiful. And truth and goodness for Plato are beyond our sensory experience. They're beyond the physical. But beauty is this interesting bridge idea, because it is manifest in our sensory experience. And because we have this erotic response to beauty, we desire the beautiful. It's a bridge between our physical experience and the ideal or intelligible world for Plato, which comes through in the Dialogue Symposium. So Eros, plays this mediating role to guide us to the ideal world for Plato. And although Whitehead's inverting Plato in so many ways, beauty still plays a very important role. And Whitehead would say that the teleology of the universe is the production of beauty. That's what everything is aiming at. And beauty for him is ever more intense forms of contrast. So more internal diversity held in harmony, right? And so if you see the evolutionary process as it's a process of complexification on some level, Whitehead would say it's this desire for beauty and the intensification of beauty that's driving that process.
It's hard not to think about bioelectricity, actually, when you think about Eros in some ways, you know? Like bioelectricity could almost be like the Eros of biology or something. I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I just, I just want to be clear about two things. One is that, yes, I mean, it's pretty clear that on Earth, at least, evolution loves bioelectricity as this cognitive glue that is helping all this happen. Maybe that's universal. Maybe elsewhere there are other completely alien architectures that use something else. I don't know, right? So the other thing I want to say is this. I mean, I've talked about this idea of mind blindness and potentially finding minds everywhere. I want to temper that by saying that what I don't think you can do is assume. I mean, so people love to look out and say, "Oh, the whole, the galaxy, the whole galaxy is this giant radiant being." Maybe, and I think we should totally be open to that. But I think those are claims that need experimental evidence. So we now have. I mean, the interesting thing is that we now have a number of uh, tools at our disposal. Some come from behavioral science, some from causal information theory and things like this that actually allow us to say something rigorous about specific systems. And we need to be using those tools so that we are neither on the side of total teleophobia and eliminativism, where you see mind nowhere, versus some kind of an unquestioning animism, where you think that there's a advanced spirit under every rock. You don't know, and you need to do experiments, and we now can, and we've been doing some very interesting, and other people have as well. In terms of showing protocols, how you can look for these things in unconventional media, and we've looked for them in gene regulatory networks and certain algorithms and cells and tissues, and and you can do it by trying to train things, trying to communicate with things. Interventional experiments. The thing is, what makes it really hard to talk about minds on a planetary scale or whatever is that to really do this properly, you have to do interventional experiments. You cannot simply observe. When you observe something sort of non-invasively, it might look complex, and you might be able to tell stories about. In fact, there was this, I forget who it was, but there was this guy a few decades ago who made these videos of squares and triangles and circles moving around in a plane, and he would show it to human volunteers, and they would say, "Oh, it's very obvious. The circle's in love with the triangle, and the square's trying to break them up." And they would tell all these stories, right? And from purely observational data, you really can't assess the cognitive level or the cognitive type of anything. You have to make specific hypotheses about what the goals are, what competencies they have, and then you have to do experiments. So that makes it very hard to do that with things on the cosmic scale, just for practicality reasons. But lots of other things that we wouldn't think of as a fodder for these kinds of ideas are very testable, and we're showing how you can test them. I mean, sometimes people say to me, "Well, with these kind of panpsychist ideas, you might as well say the weather is has a mind." Well, you can't just say it. But I don't know. Have you tried training weather systems with stimuli? I don't know. That's an empirical question. You can't assume that we found some pretty crazy things by doing the experiments with things that nobody had thought of to test this way before. So I don't think you can assume in either direction. I think you have to do perturbational experiments, which are really hard and for big scales.
On that note, I'm sure both of you have at least come across some of these notions from people like Sabine Hassenfelder, the physicist, that there actually is now at least some actual data to suggest that universal, superclusters that connect galaxies together look almost indistinguishable from brain networks. And there's been, I don't remember who conducted the study, but I remember she published an article in like Time magazine a while ago talking about this idea. I want to say I think it was like Google and some university were doing some kind of, I could be wrong, but anyway, there is some data at least to show more than anecdotally that massive galactic clusters look almost indistinguishably similar from brains. Have you spent much time kicking the tires on that?
I mean, I've seen it, and no one loves wild ideas more than me. Okay, so I'm completely
Yeah.
open to the idea, but I really don't think you can derive anything from just structural assessments. So if it looks exactly like the human brain, that doesn't actually tell you what kind of cognition it has, if it, or if it has significant cognition, whatever. I really feel strongly that in order for this to remain a scientific field and to drive real progress, we need to have specific criteria for what we're willing to accept as evidence. And I think purely observational structural data are just not sufficient to conclude much of anything. It's it's cool, it's tantalizing, but I wouldn't conclude anything on the basis of that kind of evidence.
It seems to me it's that as a speculative philosopher, I could say, who's not worried about having to establish anything scientifically.
I was going to say the same thing. I have even less responsibility. I can just say, well, Plato says the universe is an animal in the Timaeus, so seems to comport with that idea. Let's go.
Well, yeah, a kind of organism, an animal that doesn't have an environment and doesn't need to eat and doesn't have limbs because it's not got anywhere to go. Like, so it's a loose analogy with an animal that he's making to the cosmos.
Do you know what this is one of the times I hate not knowing Greek. Like, do you know what word they actually used for animal there? Is it just the standard word for animal, or is it like something that they loosely translated as animal? That's something I've been curious about.
Zuo probably is in there, or I mean,
we don't by any means need to look this up now, but
yeah, I'm not sure exactly what word when he refers to the cosmic animal, if he's using anima there, like, or suke, like soul, or if it's the prefix zuo that we use for zoology and stuff. I'm not sure. I have to look up that. But what I would say about the galactic superclusters, it just seems like the universe has this fractal like self-similar way of organizing itself at all scales. And there's some ways in which something I've said before is that we have too inflated an idea of human minds and human agency. We need to deflate that a little bit, and see that cognition is something that very much could be applied to weather systems. And what we think of as our own sort of autonomous will to, make free decisions. Like, I do think human beings have some degree of freedom, but we need to understand that as on a spectrum, with all of these other kinds of agency in nature, which are, the thing about creativity is like, and degrees of freedom is that we don't want to imagine freedom like we exist outside of the network of causes and conditions that precedes us, and we can just see the future and predict among the options and say, I will do this. Like, that's not how creativity works. When an artist is in the throes of sculpting or painting or composing, like they're creating and discovering at the same time. It's this weird interplay between planning and surprise. That's what improvisation is all about. And so I think our human agency is way more like that. And it's obvious how the rest of the natural world is engaging in, it's dipping into this space of possibility, but doing so in a way that's not like having a pre-planned design in advance of making the creative decision, but in some way being forced to improvise, right? And so if we have to change our paradigm of human agency to understand it more like that in order to begin to see other minds operative, other cognitive systems operative in nature. But yeah, I think, again, just as a speculative philosopher, that the universe is, whether we think of something as large or small, and Plato got into this also, it's kind of arbitrary. Like, we think, oh wow, galaxies are so big and these superclusters are so big. Like, what if the universe is infinitely nested in, like, there's no bottom level, there's no top level. And so instead of thinking just in terms of size, we need to think in terms of organizational structure. And we see the same patterns repeating at all scales, right? And so if we really want to inhabit an infinite universe, I think we have to think of infinity beyond just big and small, because that's not what the infinite is really about here. And obviously, this is very speculative, and we can't do experiments on a galaxy or even a star or even the whole planet. But as Mike's always saying, the philosophy that's informing our scientific investigation is going to shape the sorts of questions we think are worth asking, right? And so a different kind of cosmological backdrop, a different set of philosophical assumptions, a different imaginative background, such as the idea that the universe is a living organism of some kind, does filter into the sorts of scientific questions that get asked in particular laboratories about this or that natural process, and so it's not irrelevant what we think of the universe at the largest scale, even if we're being totally speculative about it. Because if we just assume we exist inside some kind of gas chamber, and everything going on inside that gas chamber is just like mechanical collisions or something, which is all sorts of questions we're not going to even ask when we try to understand life or thermodynamics or so on. But if we situate ourselves inside of this potentially infinitely nested series of intelligent organisms, all of a sudden, the sorts of explanations that can be sought in biology and the sorts of experiments we would do in biology really open up, and we stop being so mind blind.
Yeah. Yeah, that speaks to the importance, I think, of having like these cross-disciplinary conversations too. It allows you to expand the horizon of what you can ask, what you can think about asking, what lenses you can put upon the work you've already done or want to do. Um, but I feel like I feel like I should ask some practical questions, because we've been on the big question tip, which I obviously love and I just naturally gravitate there. But I guess one of the things I haven't even tried to address with you yet, Mike, is what do you hope practical takeaways from the work that you're doing will be in the next 5, 10 years? Like, where do you see this going? Um, what do you think has already been proven that you're just trying to sort of put finishing touches on?
Yeah. Um, yeah. Okay. And then I'll let me talk about that. Then I want to come back to something that Matt said. So look, for the future, and this relates to things that we've been talking about. I mean, obviously, there's the obvious thing that I've said everywhere else a million times is that what I think is the key, we've already shown is the case, is that by releasing some of these assumptions, such that, for example, mentalistic, teleological, and behavioral terms are only applicable to brainy animals in 3D space. If we release that assumption, we get to use this amazing toolkit that we have on other types of media, for example, cells in the body navigating other spaces, and that's how you discover novel biomedical interventions that you would have never otherwise find. And so the obvious thing is, I think, is that hopefully in the next however many years, we're able to drive a lot of this stuff through to the clinic, such that everybody can see, okay, I'm having this procedure because we are now convincing, communicating with, collaborating with, and managing the prior beliefs of my cells, not because we're micromanaging their molecular networks, right? So, wow. That's the sort of thing that we're working on. Literally taking these kind of concepts from control theory, from cybernetics, from behavioral science, from computational neuroscience, and saying, yes, cancer really is a dissociative identity disorder of the morphological intelligence. And the reason that we have this bioelectric therapeutics is because of that idea. And now we've rejoined and we've reintegrated them, just like people try to reintegrate in the psychological arena. I'm just giving you an example, like that kind of thing. So the direct thing, I think, is the biomedicine. Beyond that, however, I think also very important is this issue of ethics, and so I want to just talk about that for a second. two things. First of all, Matt was just saying about how we need to kind of deflate our human centric view. What I think is really important is that people understand that by releasing this mind blindness and by understanding that cognition is a spectrum and that there's all sorts of unconventional minds all around us, it does not actually make us less than. This is a fundamental problem. People have this very scarcity kind of zero-sum mentality, such that if other things are smart, I'm not as smart. It somehow devalues the human condition if we say that other things also have certain kinds of intelligence. People are very worried about this. This is incredibly contentious, and I get a lot of angry emails and things like that from organicists who say, look, by talking about these simple minimal systems and quote unquote machines and algorithms and all this other stuff, you are basically saying that we are like them. We are mechanical, whatever, and this really degrades the human condition. And I'm just trying to point out that this is not a zero-sum game. You can still be an awesome, agential, emergent, high-level intelligence if other things that you didn't know about also have a little bit of that magic. It's fine. We are not degraded or diminished by the fact that there's more life and more mind around us, not less. I think that's really important, because people get really freaked out about this, that this is somehow gonna slide everything towards the nihilistic sort of mechanism. And my claim is precisely the opposite. No, it's a beautiful spectrum, and many things are at different places on the spectrum than you thought. Nobody has to slide in one direction on that spectrum. That's why we need to get it right, not just make assumptions. And related to that is this issue of speculation. So yes, obviously, as speculative philosophers, it's awesome to have big ideas and think about all these different things. But for me, one of the challenges that I have and other people have is that some of these ideas end up impacting how people think about the ethics of relationships with other systems. So what I want to be clear with people about is that if I am saying, here is a system that is goal-directed, it has memory, it has valence, it has whatever, in a degree, I'm not saying it's human level, but it has a degree, it's on the spectrum, it has a, what I don't mean is the poetic, is the sense, the poetic sense that, wow, like, the whole universe could be a giant mind, maybe. But it's important to say that in certain cases, we actually have evidence that this is really the case, and that you can't relegate it to the speculative realm because it has ethics implications for unconventional, unfamiliar beings that can suffer, right? So that's why I try to always draw that fine line. That when I say that something is on the spectrum, I mean it. We have evidence, and that has implications for how you behave towards it and how you relate to it. So, which is different than other things that maybe not, like, who knows. So I'm it's absolutely good to have all the speculative ideas, but I think we are going to enter into a very diverse. If you think you've heard about diversity up until now, it's nothing. We are going to the next decades. We are all going to be living in a extremely diverse environment with cyborgs and hybrids and AIs and chimeras, embodied robotics and non-embodied. It's going to be completely wild.
Non-embodied. What do you mean?
Well, things that don't look embodied to us. That's a whole other thing. We can talk about what embodiment means. It's not. I don't think it's what everybody thinks it means. But anyway,
well, you're not going to freak me out. Trust me.
No. That's fine. I just wanted to finish this one thought. Is that the variety of other beings that we're going to be living with is going to be incredible. Some of them already exist. Many of them are going to exist as people change their bodies, and what we really want to avoid is something that humans are very good at, which is drawing in-group, out-group separations with all of the ethical ramifications that follow. When they say, yeah, you're a little bit of a different shade, I don't think you feel pain as much as, I'm like, that's an actual real thing, right? As far as analgesic delivery and the availability in hospital settings and so on. So what people are very good at is saying, I'm a real biological being. that's a machine. Okay. And, that's easy when you're talking about your toaster. That isn't the situation here. What is going to happen is you're going to have humans, and somebody's going to, I even had Jeremy make me a diagram of this just to kind of poke fun at this whole perspective. It's a guy sitting there in the park reading a nnewspaper, and you can sort of see like he's got half of his brain is standard human brain, half of his brain is engineered digital, and there's a guy behind him in one of these old 1800s outfits with a giant pair of calipers, and he's measuring the guy's head to figure out if it's more than 51% machine or not, because he wants to know if he's gonna treat him like a human being. So this is coming, and this machine versus life distinction is pernicious. It's going to lead to severe ethical lapses when people don't realize that what we're talking about is a spectrum that has implications of compassion and ethics and kindness to beings that are not precisely like us. Humans are not great at that anyway. This is going to stretch our theory of mind detectors like nothing else has before. So that's why I think it's important. I think getting this right is going to have fundamental implications for ethics. And yeah, all right. And then the very last thing I just wanted to point out, back to this idea of living in a universe that's a giant pattern. I think it is really interesting to ask, how would you know if you were part of a much larger system that was in fact right that had a mind? And I visualize when I think about that, I visualize two neurons inside a brain, and they're having this conversation. And one of the neurons is like a hard-nosed kind of materialist, and the other one's a little bit of a mystic. And the one neuron says, "Hey, look, it's all biochemistry. The universe doesn't care about us. Nothing, it's purely mechanical. Nobody cares about us." And the other one says, "I don't know. I've been watching these patterns of electrical activity in the world around us, and I almost feel like it has a mind of its own. I almost feel like we get rewarded and punished for certain things, and there's these waves get back propagated through the tissue, and I almost feel like there's something going on." And the other one says, "You're crazy. It's just chemistry." And so that in that scenario, of course, the mystic is right. They are embedded in a medium that is having what we all recognize as real mental phenomena. And so how would you know, right? If you were part of that, how would you know? I don't know. I suspect that there's some kind of Gödel result around the fact that you could never be sure of it, right? But I bet, and then this is maybe for a next discussion, because I'd love to know what you guys think about this. I bet you could gain evidence of it, and I think that evidence would look like synchronicity. I think that what it would look like are large-scale patterns that make sense, that are meaningful to you as an observer, that do not have a straightforward mechanical story associated with us. Something like that. Something like that kind of synchronicity thing. So so is it possible that the universe is a big mind? Sure, it's possible, but I think for many reasons we need to really sort of be specific in what we mean by that claim and the tools that we're going to use to really gain evidence, because all of it has implications for us.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because I heard you bring up synchronicity in that context in another podcast, and I really wanted to get to this, though I don't think we're going to have time to do so thoroughly. But yeah, I mean, I think I wanted to actually bring this up before when you were talking in the context of what if the pattern itself, the realm of forms essentially has this positive pressure on it, and there's some kind of desire, Eros, on the part of the pattern to instantiate itself in physical reality. That really reminds me of this ancient idea that was pervasive around the time of the Platonists of correspondence, of there being this sort of like this hidden language that you could learn that allowed you to, do everything and up to like manipulate reality through rituals and stuff like that. And as far away as that is from what you're doing, I think when you couple a couple of the things that we're talking about today, this notion of synchronicity and this notion that there could be this realm of forms that is exerting or that is attracting, or whichever direction you want to talk about it in, that does look like synchronicity, because you have like a literal, you have a non-causal relationship constructed of meaning where there's like at least a tertiary agent that we can't readily have access to. Like we just have the subject object relationship of I am a person, I experienced this thing out there that has meaning, and it implies that the meaning itself is coming from this unseen place. And that unseen place is most likely that same place where the pattern comes from, and where the sort of innate meaning of that pattern, or the meaning that we associate with that pattern at least, comes from. I did a whole video on this like probably a year ago at this point, kind of uh, using Penrose's three, triune model of reality as an explanation of how this could work. But anyway, I'm sure you have thoughts on this too, Matt. So before we run out of time here, I'd love to hear you riff on it.
Yeah. Well, just on the ethics piece that, I'm glad Mike brought up, to deflate a little bit our understanding of human agency and intelligence is not at all to sideline any ethical implications, but in fact to magnify the ethical implications of all of this. Because the point is, intelligence and agency, and similarly the ability to suffer or experience joy, are not the private property of human beings. A lot of more materialist minded people will say, oh, this kind of panpsychism is just wishful thinking. Wouldn't it be nice if mind was everywhere? But actually, this puts a lot of responsibility on us. It's not wishful thinking. It's actually kind of terrifying to think that there are suffering minds everywhere that we didn't even know existed, and now we have to, if we're going to be ethical, attend to that reality. And so this sort of a panpsychist cosmology is, you could almost say it would be easier for us if it weren't the case, that there were, minds everywhere. And so, I think human organisms we have to understand ourselves as examples of something that's far more pervasive, on not only on the earth, but cosmically. And what this does is it allows us to move out of this mechanistic paradigm, the old kind of mechanism, where we thought we weren't dealing with agential material, but just dead stuff, where it was all about forcing that dead stuff to do whatever we wanted it to do. And it seemed like knowing how the components work in a reductionistic way allowed us to reverse engineer things, and simple systems, we could operate that way just by imposing our designs and forcing them to behave as we want. The paradigm of, tame, right, or technological approaches to mind everywhere is instead saying we have to interact with these other beings, these other minds, through persuasion, not by trying to micromanage at the molecular scale or something, or the genetic scale, but actually engaging as agents in a process of collaboration, right? So we're moving from a paradigm of mechanical force and the imposition of design from outside the system to a paradigm of persuasion and collaboration, and like knowledge as a way of building alliances across species, like biological knowledge, and figuring out what's possible, what morphospaces can we ingress that would enhance the quality of life as a collaborative effort that we engage in with other life forms. And so it really does matter. We need how we understand which other types of beings can suffer. Because I agree, Mike, there are going to be all sorts of the cyborg type beings all across this spectrum that will be populating our social spaces very soon. They already are in some ways. And I think some of them probably, at least that currently exist, don't suffer because there's nobody home, so to speak. But it very easily could be the case quite soon that there are beings that are half machine and half organism that do suffer. And so we do need ways of thinking about that is ways that are empirically grounded, so that we can avoid making real ethical mistakes. The last thing I want to say is in regards to synchronicity, and like, how would we know that we're inside this nested series of larger minds or organisms or something? And, it reminds me of something Plato says in the Dialogue Timaeus, which is all about cosmogony and astronomy and stuff, but also in one of his later dialogues, The Laws. In The Laws, he says that the stars are our teachers. What does he mean by that? Well, if you go back to the Timaeus, he describes how the ratios which we can observe between the different movements of the fixed constellations and the wandering planets taught us math. We taught us how to keep track of time. And so there's a way in which, for Plato, the logos, if you want, or the intelligibility of the cosmos is the evidence that he would point to say we exist inside of this living organism, right? It's because we literally learned how to count and tell time and do math and geometry by watching the sky, right? And so this isn't something we made up because we're so smart from Plato's point of view. It's something that we, because we attentively observed the world out there, gained the capacity to be intelligent beings and agents, right? And so very much so for Plato, we are embedded in a mind, and that mind taught us how to be minds, And I think that type of cosmology is not ancient history anymore. It's not some superstition that now we know better. I think in so many ways, modern science in the first few hundred years of its existence did presuppose this, like Descartes, Newton, Galileo, like they all thought that that God is a mathematician, and the reason the universe is intelligible is because of that. That there's this deep mathematical order in it, and it's not that we need to refer to a creator God to make sense of science, but on some level, we should be way more surprised as scientists that the universe is intelligible to us at all.
Yeah.
Right. That raises certain questions that I don't think any kind of reductive materialism has an answer for.
Well, my friends, that's a beautiful note to end on. It's you pulled us out of the goth the goth clouds that were forming from the everything around us might be a suffering mind. That's a much better note to end it on. So, but I sincerely feel like we just got started. So this has been fantastic. Let's wrap this one up. But thank you guys both so much. I genuinely can't wait to put this out.